for the morning lecture and the evening lecture. We really are very fortunate to have the Seton lectures. They're a marvelous opportunity to think and reflect with some of the most engaging and critical thinkers of our time. We are very fortunate particularly to have these lectures because they have a history, and Sister Juliane States will tell us what that is.
Good evening. It is my privilege and great pleasure to welcome you here this evening on behalf of the Sisters of Charity to this, the 20th anniversary and the 21st annual Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series. It is my particular task to explain the origin and purpose of the series. The Elizabeth Seton series began in 1978 when the then Halifax Province of the Sisters of Charity established an endowment fund for this purpose at the recommendation and encouragement of the sisters who were on faculty here at the Mount at the time. They recommended that the theme of such a program series would focus on, quote, Christian presence in the world, past, present, and future, unquote, and which would promote in a tangible way the mission statement of Mount St. Vincent University, which describes itself as a university, quote, rooted in a Catholic tradition, unquote, and, quote, marked by a strong commitment to understanding and truth, intellectual vigor, and social responsibility. I believe this year's guest lecturer will both challenge and stimulate our thinking as we try to integrally and creatively, as we try to live integrally and creatively with the tension of a familiar tradition and the urge of an uncertain technological future. The lecture series bears the name of Elizabeth Seton in honor of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, foundress of the Sisters of Charity in America. She was born in 1774 in the New York area and died in 1821. She was a woman marked by her time and geography, and yet a pioneering woman transcending her time. Born during a period of revolution and change which brought forth a new nation, a republic strong in its zeal for truth, understanding, and social responsibility. This national zeal and revolutionary spirit marked Elizabeth's own private life. She was a wife, a mother of 5, a widow, a single parent. She was an educator and the founder of the parochial education system in the U.S. and the religious founder of the Sisters of Charity, and beyond that, even a saint. My predecessors have successfully and most cogently noted the connections between the lecture series and Elizabeth's experiences, concerns, and values. How does one do this with religion in the Canadian media? The mouse that roared. I ask. As I thought about this, I imagined Elizabeth here today in this time and how the media might present her and her causes. I suspect that just as her marriage to William Seton would have made the society pages in her time, it would most likely have received national note in today's media as well. Certainly her choices of religion, association, relationship brought both public and private ridicule and ostracism. Would it be different for her today? I think not. However, in spite of the hardship she had to endure in the domain of public opinion, she maintained throughout these challenges a profound religious conviction and personal relationship with her God that allowed her to pursue her vision. I am told that Elizabeth was small in stature and most likely very soft-spoken, as would be expected of a lady of her social class. I also know that she could be very strong-willed and zealous in her causes, most especially for her family, for the poor, and for her God. Indeed, she was a mouse who could and did roar. Finally, I would like to thank the Religious Studies Department of Mount St. Vincent University for their usual careful planning and organization of these lectures. And I'd like to end by welcoming you and our guest lecturer, Dr. Michael Higgins, to the lecture series and to Mount St. Vincent. Dr. Higgins, we eagerly await your roar.
Thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to have this chance to introduce Michael Higgins to Mount St. Vincent. We met some 20 years ago in a classroom where I was his TA, and I had heard about this dynamic and energetic and challenging professor, and I was a graduate student wanting to earn a few dollars to get my way through graduate school, and I thought, well, yes, another one of these professors. And then I went to his class. I was just astonished. I had never seen a speaker with so much passion and wit and deep, deep intellect. You'll be able to read on the brochure that you've all been handed out all of his many accomplishments. I had to edit down pages and pages and pages to even distill it down to that. There's just no way that the bulk and the breadth and depth of his work could be represented in a small little piece like this. One of the things that we were lucky enough to find out yesterday is what is in his latest book, Heretic Blood, The Spiritual Geography of Thomas Merton. Some of you may have joined us at the book launching last night. Unfortunately, there is only one book in existence in Nova Scotia because they haven't been yet released, but I can assure you that Stoddard will let you buy them when you want to. I think at this point, the best thing to do is to let Dr. Michael Higgins come to speak for himself. You will be delighted, you will be stimulated, you'll be inspired to deeper thinking, and above all, you'll be entertained. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.
I always get rather alarmed when I'm getting this description given that I'm a Merton scholar, and many of you may know. Perish because of this ignorance concerning the basic operations of modern technology. So if I suddenly perish here, it's in a distinguished tradition. I can tell you what a pleasure it is to be here, and I suspect that the faculty and staff of St. Jerome's University, where I am the vice president, are also pleased that I'm down here roaring instead of back there. They seem singularly pleased to wave goodbye to me when I left. I am pleased to be here and to be part of the tradition of the Seton Lectures, and what I want to do tonight is to talk to you about media and the religion in Canada, and to explore various kinds of things over today and tomorrow in radio and in television, the screen, and in print. First of all, let me indicate that I am not a journalist by training. And what I'm going to be talking about is not communications theory. It's not a professor of journalism's reflections on the nature and the craft of journalism. I'm not going to provide you with any kind of entree into the way that pundits and columnists work. I am, by training, an English scholar, and I teach in the Department of English and Religious Studies when I don't serve as an administrator. And my background is both rather classically defined and rather traditional in its preparation. So what I'm going to do is to talk about what I do know, not as a professional journalist, but as somebody who has worked in journalism as an avocation for over 20 years now. In 1978, I was approached by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation to work on the preparation of a series that launched me into the media. And 20 years later, I still work for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and I still write for the media at large. I'm a columnist for the Toronto Star, and I try to maintain continued intercourse, communion with the larger community. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Academy is held in such little regard in large sectors of our society, is that we've tended to be self-consciously and deliberately isolationist. We have no right to be. Knowledge should be communicated. It should be intelligible, and it should be accessible. And scholars who are involved in the engaging enterprise of making it so shouldn't be held in less esteem by the purists in the fields who think that somehow writing an article in a journal which has 2.3 readers is a matter of great consequence. And that if you have a readership of 200,000, you should be humiliated. It's a strange, upside-down perception of the value of the scholar in society that triggers that notion. I, like everybody else in the academy who's had to go up through the system, has written for learned and refereed journals, knows it's part of our training. But there's a deep unease that comes from the fact you also know, blessed few read it. And there should be some way in which you take your knowledge and you make it available for the larger community. The low esteem, as I say, that scholars often have in our society, the difficulty we have in getting the government to give us more funding, is in part brought upon us by ourselves. Anyway, I want to talk precisely about these kinds of things, and I want to give it a personal stamp or signature. I don't speak as a specialist to you. I speak as somebody whose avocation is journalism. But for 20 years, I've worked very closely with the media on several grounds. But I kind of collapsed into it, like I collapsed into lots of things, in a rather humorous way. Let me explain. In 1978, we had a conference at the University of British Columbia and the Vancouver School of Theology celebrating the 10th anniversary of the death of Thomas Merton. And we brought scholars and specialists from all over the world to gather at UBC. In a moment of then, not now, but then uncharacteristic temerity, I met with a colleague of mine, also a doctoral student, an Anglican priest by the name of Donald Grayston, now teaching at Simon Fraser. The two of us were bold enough to run off to the executive producer of the Ideas program on CBC, a person by the name of Geraldine Sherman. And we went in and we explained to her why the CBC should do a series on Thomas Merton, why it was a good idea for them to do it. She was so impressed by the fact that two graduate students would take her out for a drink and ask her to do the series that in fact she commissioned us to do it. And what she did was she ordered the CBC Vancouver studios to take their equipment and to go to the conference at the UBC and to record all the lectures that would be given. And there were many. It was a standard learned's conference. There were several concurrent sessions, a couple of plenaries, a whole range of lectures and talks. Well, the CBC studios dispatched their crew to go to the Vancouver campus to cover a conference, indeed. But it wasn't the conference on monasticism, it was the conference on monsters. Evidently, the sociology and anthropology department had a conference on the Sasquatch, the abominable snowman, Blackfoot, and several other creatures, a very un-monk-like in appearance and in significance, going on at UBC. It would appear that the Vancouver technicians had never heard of monks, but they did find monsters a deliciously inviting topic, and they went off and they taped everything on the monsters. Okay? When it was over, all the equipment tapes were sent back to the studios in Toronto. Donald Grayston and I mused about the fact that here we had a conference with no tapes. We thought perhaps Geraldine had changed her mind, and after all, we were still just graduate students, so what could we do? So we just shrugged, and that was that. In about the third week of November, I got a call from Geraldine Sherman saying, well, where are the scripts? And I said, well, Ms. Sherman, where are the tapes? And she said, well, we took 20 of them. And I said, yes, but I don't have any of them. And she said, you've got to be joking. We've advertised, it's been published everywhere. We've got a whole week of tapes. We must have a program. So she got back, thank you very much, got back, found out that she had something like 24 hours of tape on the abominable snowman and the Sasquatch. The Vancouver studios found themselves 3 technicians short that year. And I found myself hired to write, narrate, and edit, and I had never done anything like this in my life. And I had only several weeks to do it. I was at the time teaching high school at St. Michael's College School in Toronto, and the Basilian principal, Father Fitzpatrick, who looked on this with some bemusement, but figured, what the heck, he's a new teacher, we'll give it a try anyway, pretty well gave me carte blanche to work at it. If he had been a little less understanding, there would have been no series and a great deal of more monsters. So I kind of collapsed into the CBC. I've been with them ever since. I've done countless scripts, documentaries, commentaries, and other things. In the process, I've been drawn into the media, not working just with the CBC, but others as well. And in this capacity, it's given me the opportunity over the last 20 years to reflect on what role the media plays in the area of religion in Canada. So keeping that in mind, what I would like to do tonight is just an introduction to the media and religion, period, then move very briefly into radio, and then tomorrow morning talk about television and the screen, and then in the evening talk about the newspapers, the tabloids, and the broadsheets. The time is ripe for doing this. Everywhere you look these days, there seems to be a conference on somewhere or other about the role of religion and the media, not just in Canada, but anywhere. Suddenly, religion has become an interesting topic again, most particularly if it's defined rather narrowly as spirituality. One of the programs over the years I've sworn I never will go on is a program I in fact have gone on 3 times. So I'm nothing if not inconstant. I'm talking about the Ralph Ben-Mergy live program. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. If you have not, you're extremely fortunate. If you have, try to erase it from your memory. Ben-Mergy's program now, in its new configuration, well, not its latest configuration, it's yet changed, but in its configuration during the summer last, involves coming into the studio in the atrium of the CBC's Broadcast Centre in downtown Toronto, which, by the way, if you have not seen, it's wonderful to see. They have a museum on the history of the CBC and broadcasting in Canada, and all kinds of wonderful things that are available for the public. But anyway, they were shooting this program, Ralph Ben-Mergy Live. The topic, spirituality in Canada. So one of the producers contacted me. And I thought, oh, now it's Ben-Mergy. We don't actually get along. Should I really do this? But then I thought, well, no, maybe I should. Okay? And it would be good fodder for the Seton lectures. So off I went. I arrived. My job was to react to some of the commentary going on in the conference in Ottawa. There was a major conference on faith in the media held at the School of Journalism in Carleton last June. And they brought a couple of the people, the publisher of the Winnipeg Free Press, and Barry Zwicker, who is a media specialist for Vision TV, and they were going to talk about the media and religion, and then I was supposed to talk about it as well in the Toronto studio. So there was an Ottawa-Toronto hookup. Well, as you may or may not know, Ralph Ben-Mergy is a erstwhile stand-up comic, and they tend to make the worst interviewers because everything is self-referential. Everything builds up to the next joke, and so you never actually get anywhere. So I was stuck in a large atrium with scores of people, and my job was to react to some of the things that were being said. And I virtually never did, or when I did, it was completely dismissed. But I remember one thing that I found quite arousing, and that was Ben-Mergy's insistence that today is the day for spirituality. He had decided that indeed spirituality was the in thing. It was trending. All you had to do is look at chicken soup for the soul. So I suggested to him, less than timidly, with only a modicum of contempt in my voice, that perhaps he's misusing the term. Okay? There's no doubt that chicken soup or any other kind of soup for the soul is probably very good. It could be, you can find it in the self-help section. It may have some particular value for people, but it seemed to me really stretching the term to call it spirituality. And he said, well, no, that's not true. Because these kinds of books that you find in Kohl's or any of the big bookstores now, they market themselves as spirituality, and they're about self-affirmation. They are about self-expansion. They're about self-fulfillment. And I said, I have no doubt that indeed they are about all of these things. But that's not what spirituality is about. Spirituality is indeed about self-negating, self-emptying, the very opposite of what you're talking about. But he seemed entirely puzzled by the whole thing. and with characteristic penetration of intellect, he completely forgot what we had said and came back at the very end talking about my affirmation of the chicken soup spirituality school. So I was doubly humiliated for the audience at large and in my own eyes. But what it did reveal in that special moment of purgatorial wisdom is in fact what we have seen again and again in the media. I had no sooner arrived back home, sweating, angry, and not a little disturbed, when I picked up a copy of Q magazine, being read by one of my daughters, to discover an interview with Madonna where she observed that, and I quote, "Passion and sexuality and religion all bleed into one for me," end of quote. Now, no doubt they do for Madonna, and no doubt they do for her marketing agents and her publicists. In some rather peculiar way, they might even for the larger public. But somehow or other, whether it's Q Magazine or Ralph Benmergui Live or the Toronto Sun, the term spirituality has lost something in the translation. Spirituality, the Ottawa Conference or the Carleton Conference reminded us again and again, is the new word for religion. And again in the discussion that was going on between the media specialist or the media analyst and the Winnipeg Free Press publisher and myself revolved around the use of language. It was the terms they were using, it seemed to me, were largely interchangeable. Religion, ethics, church, faith, and spirituality were all the same thing. Well, of course, we know they are not, and they cannot be. They're highly defined and specific. And when we can collapse them into the same thing, then we end up with significant difficulties in communication and understanding. That would have appeared to me self-evident, and I would have thought communicators, most especially, would appreciate the value of nuance. I was disappointed, but not surprised to discover that they did not. In fact, the media faith specialist took the occasion to announce that he's an atheist. When I marveled at this, suggesting that perhaps the media and faith specialist on a faith television program who's an atheist might suggest a peculiar anomaly, he didn't seem to get the point. Neither did the publisher, who insisted on calling everything spirituality. Spirituality sells, he says. Religion does not. Okay. But it's not a matter of selling, surely. It's a matter of clarification, of instruction, of reasonable stimulation and information. Keeping all of these things in mind, okay, let's take a look at some of the observations that have been made by the press about this new thing that they've discovered with a certain panache, religion. At the same time that they've done this, they've also observed that there doesn't seem to be a great deal of interest in religion. One American conservative think tank, the Media Research Center, for instance, observed, with the kind of statistical relish one invariably finds in these things, that from 1993 to 1996, ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN, and PBS, presented roughly 72,000 evening news programs and some 104,000 morning show segments. On the evening news, only 955 stories were devoted to religion, or about 1.3%. Religious news in the morning made up 0.8%, suggesting that if you stayed up late at night, you were inclined to be more religious. Well, what does this mean? What does it mean at all? What could these statistics suggest? Surely they suggest a particularly narrow definition of what religious coverage means. And what I want to do in the course of these lectures is examine this fluid definition of religion and religious coverage to show you that it's much more complicated than just simply saying that the religion reporter or the religion beat narrowly defines as his or her province of operation ecclesiastical activity, temple activity, the kinds of things that involve religious leaders in local debates, or the kinds of things that engage the British tabloid press, the Vickers and Knickers school of journalism, that figures that the only time that religion matters is when it involves something of a sexual nature. Not true. Richard Handler, who's the executive producer of, I think, the finest single program on religion in this country, Tapestry, a program produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, has the following things to observe in a letter published for communicators. He says, and I quote, "Religion has been replaced by psychotherapy. You have lost your prophetic voice because the professor of social science can do that job, and you've lost your healing voice, talking to the religious leaders, because the psychotherapist can't do that." In other words, he says, there are several reasons for embarrassment in the public, for fear of rejection, and for the psychologizing of religion, which has held back both the faithful and the media, which doesn't know how to deal with transcendence. Handler at one point says, he found that speaking to people in a secular world, religious people in a secular world, created all kinds of problems. And I quote, "It was easier to come out as a homosexual than to admit you were a person of faith. God and faith are hidden in action and issues. Faith is filtered through social justice means, and that's how you get on the radio, because of refugees, and not because of any transcendent message." For Handler's point of view, this is a significant limiting of what the media can do in dealing with, quotation marks, the religious subjects in society. How does one define religion? Is it a cultural, political, and social determinative, or is it some kind of affectation, a decoration, what the old Thomists or scholastics would call an accidental, not something essential to who or what you are in society, or indeed what society is, but something you can add on, perhaps even a peculiarity, an eccentricity, but not essential for human and social understanding. Such a restrictive and narrow understanding of religion, of course, diminishes all of us, including the media. That point was brought home very strongly in an interesting column by Geraldine Sherman's husband, the distinguished and veteran Canadian journalist and editor Robert Fulford. In his column in the Globe and Mail called The Observer of several months past, he found the opportunity to take issue with what he thought was unfair treatment of institutional religion in society at large. And he found himself, not unsurprisingly, in a debate, combative but friendly, with the then president of Regis College, the Jesuit institution at the Toronto School of Theology, Father Jack Costello. Costello was arguing, not unreasonably, I think, that the media does not reflect in any critical way, in any self-scrutinizing way, on the ever-permeating, wholly absorbed liberal ideology and culture that defines our society. It doesn't allow this to be filtered in any reflective way. It just simply assumes it as the operating ethos. Costello suggested that perhaps this was unfair, and really what was essential was a full engagement with the prevailing ethos or ethical structures, a dialogue that in fact wasn't stacked against institutional religion, traditional religion, or any. Interestingly enough, Fulford took a full column to set it in context, and it is a rare moment in secular media history, in my experience, particularly in Canada's national newspaper, which is one of the few newspapers in the world that boasts national newspaper status with no religion editor. Okay? Can you imagine the New York Times without Peter Steinfels? Can you imagine the Times of London without Ruth Gledhill, or Le Monde without Alain? I mean, it's not possible. But Canada's national newspaper makes it a point that they do not hire, will not appoint, somebody to function as religion editor and reporter, and when there is any religion coverage, and it's precious little, it's divided up, and Joan Breckenridge will technically cover it. This is Canada's national newspaper. So you have to look at something like the Observer column in Robert Fulford, find him engaging in any kind of dramatic and meaningful way with religion and its public face. And what he says is the following. Father Costello considers liberal society pathetically conformist, locked within its own few received ideas. Costello says, There's no air to breathe that hasn't already been processed by 19th century bromides about progress or 20th century forms of existentialist despair. Journalists are reluctant to expose themselves by acknowledging the power of life that goes beyond these so-called liberal terms of reference. End of quote. Costello, by the way, is by training a philosopher, not a theologian. Interestingly, Fulford comes back and does not dispute this. He says, that reluctance shapes coverage, in my view. When we talk about the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, we almost always focus on politics and society. We omit spiritual life, the most important dimension of the Church's existence. We can talk about everything in the Church except what really matters. He says, after all, and this is Fulford speaking, the Roman Catholic Church was at the core of Western civilization for 2 millennia. There is no institution now existing that has shaped so much history. Masakazu Yamazaki, the Japanese social philosopher, gave a lecture in Toronto recently called Asian Civilization, Does It Exist? Professor Yamazaki said it doesn't exist. Asia has so many religions and ways of life that they can't possibly be bundled under the name of one civilization. But Yamazaki argued the West is one civilization in his view because it was formed by one dominant institution with a single point of view, the Roman Catholic Church. Hearing Yamazaki's argument gave me a fresh understanding of what has happened to the Church in our times. As for the media, our interest in faith has become purely instrumental. Whatever we may believe in private, we can hardly deny that. As journalists, we care about religion only as it affects public questions. Perhaps this is partly a response to the Church's more worldly acts, such as changing annulment into a bizarre Catholic version of divorce. In any case, we journalists are, in almost all our work, truly secular. We have abandoned the language of faith and replaced it with less demanding terms like tradition, community, custom, heritage, etc. Under these circumstances, argues Fulford, do we who work in the media give an account of human life that is more limited than it needs to be? Father Costello thinks so, and I agree. Fulford agrees. Well, that's a rare admission, both public and otherwise. Now, one could make the case it is not really the province or the provenance of the media to debate, to look into and examine such terms as transcendence or kenosis or self-negation or whatever. That these are specifically theological, mystical, doctrinal terms, and that somehow or other they don't cross over into the public discourse. But they do. They cross over just as meaningfully as the language of the clinical psychologist or the political scientist or the pollster or the social scientists, whose jargon considerably infects, that's a negative way of looking at it, or informs, that's a positive way of looking at it, public discourse. But nonetheless, it is there, to be tasted, to be savored, to be argued with. When was the last time a theological concept or a notion or a term penetrated national consciousness? When was the last time theologians were given a platform for reasonable debate commensurate with those held by social scientists or commentators or professors or experts from other fields? It's rare. The only time they drag out religious studies professors to make any kind of national commentary is usually when there's a religious crisis, a scandal, or the Pope is coming for a visit. I know, I've been there. And believe me, traveling or covering the Pope's visit isn't all it's cracked up to be. So what does it mean? It means in many ways that the role of religion in the media is an unreflected, unmediated, often trivialized area. Ironically, at the same time that editors, newspaper, magazine reporters, producers in television networks are discovering that religion sells, that spirituality is meaningful, that if you put them in bookshops, they'll be picked up quicker than most things, at the same time we are ill-equipped to deal with it. Just give you an example of some of the things that have happened. In the fall of 1997, there was a Challenge for Change conference held at Waterloo Lutheran Seminary dealing with reading between the lines, media and values. Large numbers of people showed up. At the same time, at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto, there was an ethics and the media conference. Again, huge numbers showed up. This was followed in the spring of 1998 with the Carleton University School of Journalism Faith and the Media Conference, in which big names were present. A Southern global poll published in most of the Southern chains, of course in the Southern newspapers in Canada, indicated that spirituality was on the rise, at the same time that denominational religion, whatever that may mean, or institutional religion, considered its irreversible decline. Maclean's featured a whole December issue around matters concerning Jesus' divinity and several other seasonal-related theological reflections, at the same time looking at the growing or burgeoning interest in spirituality. Right across the country, people give seminars in the corporate and business sector to whip you up to be spiritual. Not infrequently, if you look at ads in various of the business and corporate magazines, you will find that there are people, especially trained now, whose job it is to go out and conduct spirituality seminars. Some large industries are hiring spirituality specialists or consultants. Okay? But somehow, in all of this, what are we doing? Can any of you imagine Teresa of Avila serving as a consultant someplace? Or Bede Griffiths? Or Thomas Merton saying, oh yes, I'm going off, I'm the Trappist consultant for the CBS network, I'm going to work with them to develop their inner selves. Not very likely. What you see is a growth industry, but it's a growth industry in part predicated upon a specifically narrow interpretation of a palatable religion, a feel-good religion, a religion where the boomers can look now at themselves and decide on some inner journeying. There's nothing too threatening about that, of course, and I don't wish to poo-poo it. It has its role. It has its place. Indeed, chicken soup for the soul has its place as well. But to consider it serious spirituality, or indeed religion, it seems to me a mistake. Books in Canada, in again highly uncharacteristic move, published a whole issue on religion in the country. Its senior editor, Norman Doidge, asked at the beginning the following, or observed at the beginning the following. We have devoted this issue of Books in Canada to examining the state of religion in Canada because we suspect that this is a moment of religious flux. There are signs that religion, far from being dead, is hanging in. Whereas the ranks of agnosticism once swelled, mostly at the expense of religion, it now seems that they sometimes are swelling at the expense of those who were once atheists. Now that may or may not be arguable, and the whole issue itself drew upon all kinds of people, writers, composers, political pundits, business people, scholars, those in the academy and those working in society at large, all kinds of different voices coming together to talk about religion in Canada. And as you could well imagine, even if you haven't had the opportunity of reading it yet, there's no consensus on anything. It's a classic Canadian response. You get this huge variegated mosaic, but it's very difficult to draw any common conclusions from it. You can, I think, safely draw, however, one conclusion, and that is that religion and religious subjects are indeed not dead. They are not dead. They're extremely lively, it seems to me. It's how we deal with them in the media, however, that's going to be our particular focus. Let me suggest something, too, that never ceases to amaze me. The United States, of course, has separation of church and state, at least legally, at least constitutionally. It's hard to see that it is that way, but that's the way it is. Similarly with England. England is a country that has, well, not separation of church and state, of course you have the Church of England, but in England you have perhaps the greatest de-Christianization process in public evidence of most of the European nations. And yet the British are desperate about religious news. There isn't one major tabloid or broadsheet, whether it's the Independent, the Guardian, the Times of London, the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, indeed, because both the tabloids and the broadsheets all have serious religion editors and reporters who provide, if not daily, several times a week, intelligent reportage and discussion on religious matters. You go into a bookstore in England. I was there, not the last time, but the time before, when I had just co-authored a book called The Jesuit Mystique. HarperCollins in England picked up the rights, and so I went over to England to do a series of interviews and whatnot. And I was stunned when I went into several of the bookstores to discover how many of the books, not the one I had written, unfortunately, but how many of the books were on the bestseller list. Books of ostensibly religious nature. A latest study of Bonhoeffer, a huge book on Archbishop Rancy, some investigation into this, and not by and large salacious undercover exposés of Anglican villainy, but serious reflections on the nature of meaning and religious figures in the country. They were on the bestseller list. They had prominent place in the bookstores. Similarly, if you go to Barnes & Noble or any of the big stores in New York City, you will often find the religion section burgeoning. Not infrequently, you will find in the religion bestseller list, think most particularly of Kathleen Norris, who never seems to be off the bestseller list, of absolute and well-deserved interest in religion. And then you come to Canada. You come to us. And it is as if somehow it doesn't exist at all. You're hard-pressed, I'll talk more about this in the final lecture when I look at the print media. You're very hard-pressed to find religion editors in the country. I think there are two. We have two now, possibly three, most certainly two. One for the Ottawa Citizen and one for the Vancouver Sun. The Toronto Star, Canada's largest newspaper, does not have a religion editor. It has somebody who has responsibility for the life section, who takes over putting together the religion page. Okay? And you have what are now called faith and ethics reporters. Many of the newspapers have them. But you do not have a religion editor. Okay? And that's a significant drop from the situation of less than a decade ago, when most of the major dailies in the country had people with specific responsibility for the religion beat. In terms of religious books being bestsellers in Canada, the only one that I can think of is the one that Ron Graham brought out about 9 years ago now, about 8 years ago now, that actually got shortlisted for the Governor General's Award. But they're precious few. Now I want to reflect a bit on that, because I think that there is a crisis situation in Canada in this matter. Certainly, vis-a-vis British statistics, far more Canadians go to places of worship on a regular basis than the average Briton. It's something like 4 to 6% of the United Kingdom worships regularly. It's kind of stunning, isn't it? You wouldn't have known that from the Princess Diana's funeral, but that's a rare occasion. A nation in grief, a nation in prayer is a rare occasion. The C.A.B., the Church of England, is embedded into everything that is English culture, but its presence is largely titular. And even the Roman Catholics, the recusants, the new converts, they're fairly significant reportage and coverage that they get, the great interest, for instance, in whether Tony Blair will or will not take the road to Rome or cross the Tiber. This is national news. Nonetheless, attendance at religious services has dropped significantly, even since the war, and most particularly since the 50s. In Canada, it hovers somewhere between 25 and 32%, depending on how you read the statistics, and everybody seems to read them differently. But by comparison to many European countries, Canada is still a church-going nation. I'm not talking about synagogues, temples, and other places of worship. I'm talking specifically here about churches, but it also applies, you can extrapolate, with the exception, I think, of the newer immigrant religions that have come to Canada that have a greater cultural cohesive sense. In the United States, however, it hovers around 50 to 52%. More people go to church in the U.S. than they vote in the presidential election. It's very significant. That's a really interesting observation, I think. More people go to church on a regular, weekly basis in the U.S. than vote in their presidential elections. Now, we can't even conceive of that up here. It's just simply not true. And religion and the media in Canada, of all the English-speaking countries, I came back having done some research in Australia recently, because I'm working on a book with a colleague of mine to be published by HarperCollins in about 2001, 2002. And one of the things is we're looking at some of these issues in Ireland, England, the United States, Canada, and Australia. And again, in Australia, I found a level of coverage of religion in the Australian, the Sydney Herald, Morning Herald, other newspapers, significantly superior to what we get in Canada. So what's happened to us? I mean, why is this the case? Why have we so privatized religion in this country that it's not even a significant newsworthy subject? I found, by looking at one list in one of our larger newspapers, the pecking order of their editors. Okay, and this was a particularly hierarchical newspaper, and took great care in putting its editors, its vice editors, and its sub-editors, and everything in order. The religion editor is at the bottom of the page, beneath the wheels and the food editor. That's where we've ended up, which I suppose is precious better than being beside the obituaries, where we appear in several other newspapers, either beside the obituaries, the comic page, or wheels. I can remember in a fight with the Toronto Star several years ago, when they were in the process of cutting back their length in their showcase or literary section, which had a kind of also deliciously religious focus, because they had found after they had done their survey that people wanted an additional wheels section. Now, I don't know if there's a wheels section in the Halifax newspapers, but that's basically a section of the Saturday newspaper that deals with automobiles. Okay? What does this say about us? Well, I think we need to take religion extremely seriously. I think that Robert Fulford, the former editor of Saturday Night, is right. I think that Ken Lapointe, who is the new editor of the yet unnamed, but most probably to be named, National Post, Conrad Black paper in Toronto, who, at their word, when they talk about the importance of religious coverage in the newspapers. But having said all of that, I was struck by the juxtaposition of two interesting articles that came out on the same day. One was the full-paged treatment of an address given by the Cardinal Archbishop of Toronto, Aloysius Ambrosic, no personal fan of the media, I might add, who spoke about the liberal ethos and the importance of having religion taken seriously. And Ambrosic observed the following, which seems to me a solid point. The media ought to know, and I it to be a serious bit of coverage on the Vatican City State. And it was a fairly substantial treatment, and it was called Heavenly Hosts Run the Vatican Web. And what it was is to talk about the three new Vatican computers named after Raphael, Michael, and Gabriel. Okay? So what is it if religion hasn't become the replacement for the morning joke? Okay? You could have found that at the bottom of the Globe's joke column. This is an important thing, the Vatican's three computers, the heavenly web. It misses the point by a mile. It trivializes religion. At a time when the Balkans once again have been relit, and it looks more than likely that the incendiary situation that exists in Albania is not going to be easily doused, when we continually lament the problems that exist in the Middle East, and the concerns that we have over the growth of the Taliban, and the constant misrepresentation of Islam as nothing but terrorist fundamentalism, the informed reflection on religion is more critical now than it ever has been. The issue, for instance, most recently with Bill Clinton, may appear on the surface to be about sexuality, about misdeeds, about political chicanery. I suggest it's also about a culture in religious crisis. It is also about a denuded morality. It is also about civil responsibility and morality. And those are religious questions. Again and again, however, what you see as a religious issue is a trivialized caricature of what is. Most recently, we had at St. Jerome's Helen Prejean. You may know her. She's the American St. Joseph's sister who's the author of Dead Man Walking. And she is quite a remarkable figure. She came to St. Jerome's. We had to double the size of the room to accommodate the some 1,000 students and others who came to hear her talk about her work with death row inmates in the United States. All right? Now, her lecture was a performance. Okay? But it wasn't a performance just simply in a calculated or manipulated way. Her passion was redolent with conviction. She fired the audience, and I don't know how often this comes across your table, but it comes across mine very often. We're again and again and again reminded of the fact that in order to compete as a university, we must have the best hardware, we must have the best technology, we must have everything to engage the students' attention, to hold their rapt view for a precious 49 minutes. She came into the room, small, came up on the dais, had only her microphone, no notes, no equipment, no technical wizardry, and she held the audience enwrapped for 90 minutes. You could hear a pin drop. It was the human voice, it was human passion, it was conviction, it was art, but it was also integrity. And she said that when she had been contacted by Susan Sarandon, who plays her in the film version, her husband, Tim Robbins, was the director, they had enormous difficulty getting Hollywood to take them seriously, and no one in Hollywood would support it. They all said, who's going to go to a film about a nun? There'll be no violence, there'll be no sex. The only time films about nuns ever work is when it stars Whoopi Goldberg, or The Nun Story, or The Flying Nun. In other words, a trivialized caricature of a life of meaning. That's only when it works. This nun, however, blew them out of the water. She defied all their caricatures. She was persistent in her witness value. She played her cards straight. She told the story in sometimes anguished detail, anxiety-inducing in the extreme, I might add. But she told the story full of human warmth. She was a religious subject. The story of Dead Man Walking is a religious film. It's now, by the way, being made into an opera and also into a play by Terence McNally, the New York Catholic playwright who's also written Corpus Christi about a gay Christ, and he's been apostatized, and the play's been closed and then reopened, and he's engaged in enormous controversy, but nonetheless, McNally has seen the extraordinary value of this woman's witness and the inherent drama involved in this. In short, as I listened to her speak, this was only about a week and a half ago, it suddenly seemed abundantly clear to me, incarnated in her language and in her presence, that that's what religion and the media is about. Okay? One of the reasons I think that Hollywood's effort again and again to insert a religious theme into either sitcoms or dramatic serials fails is because at no time do they ever take it seriously. But I'll talk more about that when I get to the screen. This is a long way to get to radio, which is the first lecture. You're thinking to yourself, my God, it must be coming to the end. We haven't got to the radio yet. I don't intend to keep you very long, but I thought it was important to do this kind of groundwork, first of all, so that when I cross-fertilize over the three lectures between print and radio and television, you're not going to say to yourself, why is he there and what? So I will recapitulate some of the argument, but I'll also do a fair bit of cross-fertilization. Now what I want to do, having given you some kind of foundational or groundwork reflections, and they are my own, open, arguable, and quite disputable. This is no ex cathedra voice speaking here. I want now to shift specifically to radio. When I talk about religion and the media in Canada, you will find again and again I talk about religion and the media outside Canada as well, because we have to have a yardstick of comparison. I first started when I was crafting these, thinking of putting them together, writing them, and I didn't write them. I thought, well, you know, let's talk very specifically in a very focused way about religion and the media in Canada. And I felt that this is inadequate because there's nothing to compare this with. Right? We need to compare it with other countries that are like us, where the language, say, the principal language of communication is English, hence England, Ireland, the United States. And so I will be doing these kinds of things to give you some sense of how it is done elsewhere, to show you what are our peculiar Canadian slants on issues, and those areas in which I think there are marked deficiencies. Let me start off with, when was the last time, in public broadcasting at least, that you turned on your radio or your television and you heard morning prayer? You still can on the BBC. The British Broadcasting Corporation's daily service prayer is available every day to start the network, as indeed there was a meditation late in the evening to conclude the programming for the day. It's not limited to Christianity by any means. Rabbi Lionel Blue, who's one of the great Jewish celebrities in England and just an exquisite writer, is often a featured commentator. The distinguished Loretto Nunn, Lavinia Byrne, is often a commentator. They run the gamut. Ruth Gledhill, who works for the BBC but is also the principal religion editor for the Sunday Times, also works for the daily also provides the daily service prayer. She observes at one point that, and I quote, "Religion must remain a central part of the BBC's broadcast output for as long as the BBC itself exists." Can we say that for the CBC? Let me repeat. Religion must remain a central part of the BBC's broadcast output for as long as the BBC itself exists. And the current governor, or the head of the BBC, concurs. You may or may not remember that there was a CBC religious advisory. It was dissolved 10 years ago. Would that the CBC could say the same. At the same time, however, though one might argue that such a public statement or declaration cannot fit in with the CBC's mandate, what does fit in with the mandate are various specialized programs on radio that deal with the topic of religion. Let me give you one example. I said earlier that the most impressive program on religion in the country is Tapestry. I want to give you an example of how it's done. Not too long ago, a program was played about a rabbi who is also a psychiatrist, a juvenile psychiatrist who works at a hospital for sick children in Toronto. His name, Dr. Neil Westridge. And what the Tapestry producers did was they said, okay, we're going to take this program, and it was only part of the program, but it was a significant item. We're going to talk about what really meaningful spirituality or religion means in the marketplace. Not as a narrowly private endeavor or enterprise, but something that's there where we connect. So they went and they spoke to the rabbi, who is himself, as I said, a psychiatrist. He had gone to McMaster Medical School, then did his residency, and ended up a psychiatrist at Sick Children's. Now what Tapestry does, and this is where radio best achieves its end, is provide narrative. Radio does not successfully provide diagnostic analysis. Okay? Well, we know TV doesn't do that, but certainly radio itself is limited in what it can do that way. What it must do is provide narrative. If you listen to the Ideas series, even when they're dealing with ideas, and they do more than anybody other similar program in all of North America. That's why it's picked up by National Public Broadcasting in the United States and indeed by the Australian Broadcasting Commission and the BBC in England. It's precisely because they do concentrate on ideas, but they know that the only way it can work is if it's carefully woven with a human narrative, that the attention simply wanders, that abstraction for its own sake is ultimately self-defeating, that there are only so many in the world whose nighttime reading is Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Somewhere along the line, you have to engage the imagination and the sensibility at another, more visceral level before you can move them into consideration of the more sublime ideas. And so what they do is they carefully, in this program, get the rabbi to talk about those tortured moments in his medical training when everything failed, counterbalancing it with those moments when his rabbinical training and his deeply informing religious sensibility saved him. He gave one splendid example. A phrenologist in the medical school, was giving a talk to the first-year medical students, and was asking some fundamental questions of human life. And the students were very rapt in attention, and the professor stopped, and they said, "I can go no further, I have no answers for you." And the medical class was stunned, because they're trained to have an answer for everything. And here their senior medical professor said to you, "I have no answers for this. This is outside my competence." Turned to the rabbi, who was stunned by this, and didn't know that anybody knew he was a rabbi, and asked him to address it. which he did, as he said in his interview, awkwardly, haltingly, embarrassed. But it was important. It was important because there was a recognition of that liminal area of human life, okay? Of the presence of the transcendent and mystery, which is in itself inexhaustible, and that medical science respects but cannot reduce to manageable parts or quantifiable reality. Interestingly enough, he said that when he was on duty one time doing his rounds in the hospital, in the burn clinic in the Toronto General, they had brought in a mother and her 2 children. They had been seriously burned. One of the children had perished en route to the hospital. The other suffered exquisite agony and died. The mother was improving significantly. The physicians and attending staff had concluded that it would be unwise for the mother to know that the other daughter had died. So no one said anything. One particularly sensitive nurse, realizing that the mother, writhing in pain, might want some soothing music, put on the station. It may have been the CBC, it may have been some other station, doesn't matter. What happened is she caught it during the news broadcast, which announced the death of the daughter. The mother's face turned to the attending physician. Serenity came over her eyes and her lips, and she died right then. Now, the rabbi said the extinguishing of the spirit here could probably find some kind of pathology. Some kind of psychologist can sit down and say, yes, I think we can understand in the context of this, and the power of Thanatos and all this. We can all find explanations, I suppose, that are at least serviceable, if not ultimately persuadable. But he said that for him, this extinguishing of the spirit reminded him again of the utter inadequacy of words, of the power of love. He did not see this as defeat. He saw it as love. That was his reading of it. He then spent a great deal of his time consoling the others who were in attendance, racked with guilt by what they had seen as an inadvertent act of homicide. Now, the CBC program, whatever the merits of the rabbi-psychiatrist's interpretation, leaves this raw material unalloyed, not carefully hairbrushed for your devouring, but there for you to attend to. I remember I was lying down, it was a Sunday afternoon, lying down on the bed the children were outside playing. My wife was off, she's a pianist, rehearsing someplace, and I was alone in the house, and I found it so arresting. I woke right up. I just, my heart palpitating, the way it was told, the careful, painful narrative of the telling. Now, we moved on from there to all the minute ethical considerations, the ramifications, what this meant, and in relation to other things that he discovered on his rounds. But the focus became the intense ethical and religious experience of the single individual who didn't disguise it under the cover of scientific objectivity or professional detachment or journalistic disinterestedness, but dealt with it at the human level. The radio communicated or mediated that at the human level and allows the entree into the consideration of the deeper concepts through the human medium, not in spite of it, through the human voice, and not indifferent to it. Other CBC programs like Open House, Testament, and Celebration over the years have done likewise. I've written several scripts for Celebration and indeed for Testament, and I've always they're very different in what you have to craft and how you put it together and how you deliver it. But I'm amazed by the constant balance between artistic integrity and genuine, though controlled, spontaneity. So be not deceived. Programs are edited. They're finely tuned. They're careful products. But nonetheless, when they're done correctly and are sensitive to the human spirit, radio and religious broadcasting at radio doesn't arouse, doesn't preach, doesn't evangelize, is not engaged in proselytizing. It is engaged in that which all aspects of the media should be engaged in, exploration. That's what we need. We need the media to explore, not to apologize, not to defend, not to denounce, not to expose, but to explore. Now, the others occasionally will certainly have their role to play, particularly in scandals or major stories that need to be brought to light. I remember John Redekop, a particularly conservative religion correspondent for Christian Week, who now teaches at Trinity Western University in political science out in Burnaby, or Langley, British Columbia, observing, and Redekop is no sensitive or enthusiastic admirer of the secular media, but he said the whole issue of sexual abuse in the churches, whether it's Mount Cashel, or whether it's the Mennonite community in Saskatchewan, or whether it's the misdeeds of a United Church circuit rider, or whether it's an Anglican vicar, or whatever, all these instances of sexual abuse have only really been treated because the secular media forced it into the open. Redekop, as I say, no mean critic of the secular media, was right in acknowledging that. When it comes time to expose and to investigate, very often the religious press backs off because it sees this as a negative feature. It doesn't want to handle it. It sees its job as largely apologetic. But indeed, really, between the Scylla and Charybdis, these two pillars of exposure and apology, surely lies the proper avenue of exploration, of investigation. And that's what programs like Open House, Testament, Celebration, and Tapestry have done. Now, the earlier ones, Open House, Testament, and Celebration, don't exist anymore. Tapestry is their most recent incarnation, and it's exquisitely executed. If you look at the non-public or commercial broadcast system in the country, you will discover that by and large it doesn't hold a candle to the CBC at all. Occasional university networks and non-profit radio stations like CGRT in Toronto do a commendable job, but they simply do not have the resources of the CBC. And on one occasion, I remember, I don't, and it may be my inherent snobbery, but I don't like working for the commercial radio or networks. And CFRB, which is Toronto's largest radio network, station, contacted me and asked me to come on one of their talk programs. And I really don't like them because they're undisciplined and they go everywhere and you don't know what you're going to do, and religion seems to bring out all the kooks. I don't know, but it was really a concern for me. But they said, well, we want you to talk about veritatis splendor and evangelium vitae. Well, I figured there's nobody in the country that's going to want to talk about this on talk radio, so this is kind of safe. I'll do this. And so I went. And I was supposed to be on for 20 or 25 minutes, figuring I'll get lucky if I get 2 minutes out of this. Okay? And it started at 11:05. At 15 to 3 in the morning, I was still on. And I said to them, he said, we can go to 6. I said, no, we can't. I can't. I'm out of here. And I've never gone back on the talk radio as a consequence. Nobody wanted to talk about veritatis splendor and evangelium vitae. I was right on that. I was absolutely right on that one. But because somebody was talking about religion, everybody has an opinion. Everybody wants to talk about it. And they ranged from the bizarre to the enlightened. One young lawyer who had recently come back from Central America was very interested in the interstices of the debate between the Vatican and the Archbishop of Managua over some fine-tuning in liberation theology. So answering his question, and then moving to another one who, not self-evidently bonkers, asked me if it was true that the College of Cardinals had been replaced by extraterrestrials. I said, anything is possible in Rome, but I thought it highly unlikely nonetheless. Okay? So you get a whole range of opinion. I can remember, I'm cross-appointed in 2 departments. I'm a full professor in English and religious studies. And when I'm on the plane or when I'm traveling and I don't want to talk to somebody, I'm tired, I need some work to do, and invariably, as you know, people are friendly on the plane, or often are, somebody sits down and asks you what you do. If you do not want to talk, you say to them, you're a professor of English. And they say, oh, my grammar's not very good, and they won't talk. Okay? Obviously, they don't know many professors of English. Okay? If you want to talk, if I want to talk or I feel in the mood for it, I'll say, I teach religious studies. Let me tell you about my aunt. And then we're off. Okay? And the rest of the flight is full of discourse. So what do? Well, what I do is I don't go on talk radio anymore, because that's virtually uncontrollable, and I limit my attention to the CBC, where I seemed at least to be able to discipline myself. I'd like to end tonight's lecture by playing a short part of the first program, Program 1, of the idea series called The Jesuit Mystique. This was the last series that I wrote, that was aired in 1995. And I want you to listen to it in the light of some of the things we have talked about. Now, this is the first part is a biographical program. I want you to see how the editor and the writer, well, the writer is me, the editors, the writer, and the rest of the crew work very carefully to connect narrative with commentary, to capture ordinary drama with the communication of historical ideas and dates, to make it alive in the car or in the living room or where the person is listening to the radio. This is not, quotation marks, religious broadcasting. It probably wouldn't make it on Crossroads Christian Network. Mother Angelica would have a heart attack if she ever heard it. Lots of people would certainly think of it as secular broadcasting, but believe me, it's religious broadcasting. So let me just play you very briefly the opening section. I want you to note the use of the framing device. Now, here we go. The framing device in terms of where we're going to begin and where we're going to end, and how we move between, again, drama, narrative, daily recording, backdrop, and everything. I'm not playing the whole 60 minutes, so that horror, that look of horror that many of you have on your face, you needn't keep it there. We'll only be a few minutes. Here we go. All right.
April 7, 1541, a Spaniard named Francis Xavier set sail from Lisbon on a vessel named the Santiago. He was bound for the East Indies. His voyage took him down the west coast of Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope. He went north to Mozambique, then across the Indian Ocean to Goa, a little way south of Bombay, where he arrived in May of 1542. For the next 10 years, Goa would be the headquarters for his missionary activities in the East. Francis was a member of the original group that is now the largest religious order in the Roman Catholic Church, the Jesuits. For more than 450 years, they have fanned out around the world to preach the gospel. Jesuits have been engaged in almost every area of human endeavor: science, the arts, law, engineering, medicine, teaching. They are famous for their discipline and rigorous training, and have inspired respect and affection, as well as fear and criticism. Tonight on Ideas, biographer and professor Michael Higgins begins a three-part series about the Jesuits, which he calls the Jesuit Mystique.
The Jesu is the mother church of the Jesuit order. It is located on one of the busiest streets in Rome, the Corso Vittorio Emanuele. Across the street is the headquarters of Italy's Christian Democratic Party, and just a short walk away is the city hall. The Jesu was built in the late 16th century. It's considered one of the greatest architectural achievements of its time, and it influenced the design of sacred buildings for hundreds of years to come. Inside are the remains of Ignatius of Loyola, the vast courtier-turned-priest who founded the Company of Jesus here in Rome in 1540.
In some sense, he's one of the first modern men. He bridged a moment in history when one world was dying and a new world was being born.
Thomas Lucas is a Jesuit cultural historian. He says that Ignatius had a new and radical vision of how Christianity could be brought into people's lives.
The Jesu was designed not to be a place of mystery, but to be a place of communication. Very different from the medieval cathedrals where it's dark and vertical. The thrust of the Jesuit churches in general is horizontal. a long, wide, unencumbered nave, which was used as an auditorium for preaching and for teaching. Very clearly visible altar area, so that those coming into the church can hear and can see. And that the word has to be heard and preached and celebrated in holy places by holy people. And for Ignatius, the holy place was the street corner in the middle of downtown.
Ignatius was born Inigo Lopez de Loyola in the year 1491. He was the youngest son of a prominent family in the Basque region of northwestern Spain, and he was their 11th child. The family were prosperous landowners, members of the lower nobility. Soon after Inigo was born, his mother died. He was nursed by the young wife of a local blacksmith who reared him with her own children, loved and cared for him, and taught him his first prayers. When he was 15, Inigo was sent by his father to live with Juan Velázquez de Cuellar, chief treasurer to King Ferdinand. Velázquez taught him the manners of a courtier, fencing, dancing, riding, and introduced him to the Romance literature that was popular at the time. Inigo was the ideal gallant. He was good at everything he did, and was a promising candidate for a post at court.
Although I was attached to the faith, I did not live in conformity with it, and I did not avoid sin. Rather, I was addicted to gambling, dissolute in my affairs with women, argumentative, and ever keen to demonstrate my prowess with a sword.
Velázquez died in 1517. Inigo, now in his mid-20s, had to look for a new job. He found work as a man-at-arms with the Viceroy of Navarre. He would soon face the challenge that would change the course of his life. In 1521, France invaded Spain. King Francis I sent a force of 12,000 men to Pamplona, the capital of Navarre. They laid siege to the city. The Spanish were badly outnumbered. They were about to surrender when Inigo turned up on the scene with 100 experienced militia. He convinced the commander in Pamplona to put up a fight until reinforcements arrived, and a battle ensued. It lasted only 6 hours before French artillery breached the walls of the city. In the fighting, Inigo was hit.
What happened there was that the city was prepared to give itself up to the French.
This is Jack Costello, a Jesuit. He is president of Regis College in Toronto.
But Ignatius, 29, brave and foolhardy, took a small group of men and went to defend the fortress outside the city that had already chosen to surrender. And it was during the battle of defending it that a cannonball smashed into his leg, brushed against the other leg, and left him very seriously wounded. That, believe it or not, is the turning point of his life. A cannonball gone.
And lest I too be felled by a cannonball for keeping you this long, I'd best bring this to an end. Thank you. Now, I am open for questions or anything like that to talk about what I've spoken about tonight. And I just should say that, as you would notice if you were listening to this carefully, that we move very quickly and very smoothly between various things. And part of it, again, is driven, as I mentioned to you before, by the necessity of narrative and the fact that you are telling a story. That way you engage people. And then you begin to explore the ideas, concepts, and other matters later. Yes?
I have a very great need to ask you to explain your concept of the word spirituality.
My concept of the word?
Spirituality. I feel that you were somehow denigrating the concept, and I'd like to hear what it means to you.
Well, I certainly don't think I was denigrating it. What I was denigrating was what I understand to be the misuse of the term. What I understand spirituality to mean is either that discipline or that openness or that system or that movement which allows a human being to grow deeper by discovering his or her inner strength in order to be able to achieve authentic as opposed to false freedom. Now, since that kind of lifelong search transcends all religious boundaries, is not specific to one religious tradition alone, but is indeed a universal undertaking, it is reasonable to conclude, I think, that spirituality is essential to any human self-definition. What I do denigrate, you're quite right in this, and what I do regret is the fact that there are people who take this precious and lifelong undertaking and they turn it into something that deals with not much more than a Western commodification. Somehow or other, okay, we've achieved success in this level, let's now have success in the spiritual level. Let's feel good about ourselves. Let's do this kind of thing. And I think what happens there is they lost, specifically in certain Western traditions, but I also think Eastern, of the fact that spirituality is a lifelong process of losing oneself, not gaining oneself. It's a lifelong process of emptying yourself, not fulfilling yourself. In other words, it seems, to me at least, to be the opposite of what some think and some would like to market as spirituality. That's what I meant.
But if you combine that with a belief in a power, transcendent power, power outside of yourself, surely you are filling yourself with that power, not emptying yourself. You empty yourself in order to be filled.
Well, yes, I suppose in a way, and there's certainly some instance when you're engaged in a kind of reciprocity, you're right. But I think that if you look at many books, programs, cassettes, and whatnot that are involved in the marketing of spirituality, I think you will discover very quickly that we're talking about feel-good operations. We're not talking about the search for genuine or authentic freedom. Yes, yes. Well, and I don't think there's any disagreement on that.
But I don't see it as simply an empty, a self-negation, a self-defacing, but rather a fulfilling experience.
Well, I think yes, but no, it's a good point, but I think you're using language a little differently than I am here. I don't think that the act of self-emptying is itself an act that diminishes you. I think it enriches you. Okay, I think it completes you. And I think in that we would be in agreement. Yes?
Dr. Higgins, I just noted in today's paper that a drama production for the CBC has started in this city. And according to today's paper, it finds a Catholic priest going through a crisis of faith when a long-time parishioner and friend is discovered feeding Holy Communion to her pet food. What do those kinds of programs offer in the model that you define, and how should the common person react to it?
Well, what you talk about is news to me. I didn't know that. It sounds rather surreal and dadaist, if anything else. I think that there are undoubtedly various instances where religion and religious topics are treated in a cavalier and unprofessional way. And I think in those instances, one has to say, well, what is the operating intention here? Just simply to poke fun or to mock. And I think that that's deplorable. I don't know how we can censor it. I don't know if it's even wise to censor it. Certainly that just compounds the difficulty. But I think we need to exercise some kind of critical judgment about the value of such a thing. And there's no question in my mind that various producers, both for the public network and for the commercial networks, often look for things that will sell. And they can't be persuaded sometimes that deeper things sell. But they're satisfied that the superficial has the immediate appeal which will grab the attention of the advertisers and run with it. Certainly Canadian cinema, Canadian programs tend to be more Swiftian and dangerously ironic or satirical than American programs. I'm not thinking just of the Ken Finkelman work, you know, exploring the undercurrents or the underside of media life in Canada, but I think if you look, the kind of political comedy that you found traditionally in Double Exposure, and you have to a slightly lesser degree with Royal Canadian Air Force, indicate that Canadian audiences and Canadian artists are prepared to go further than their American counterparts. Americans tend to be much more conservative about public taste and what will be accepted by the public. But there is a sense, nonetheless, in which one crosses the line, and I don't know the full details about what you're speaking about, though I don't deny that it's true, I'm sure it is true. But it would seem to me that in the old days, when the CBC had a religious advisory council, where some of these ideas could have been mooted and debated, somebody could have said, or somebody would have proffered the opinion, well, I don't think that this is quite the best route to grow, or perhaps if we're going to do this, it should be better nuanced, or this is perhaps a sensitive treatment of the issue, or whatever. But I think with the disbanding of the Religious Advisory Council, the CBC cut off a natural consultative channel, which I think we can sometimes see and experience. I am not a great devotee of religious pillaring, and I do particularly appreciate the fact that audiences can find themselves quite upset by what appears to be, and what sometimes can be, a blasphemy. But I'm reminded of T.S. Eliot's famous Virginia lectures, After Strange Gods, in which he makes it very clear, talking about the blasphemy laws in England, and this is post-Eliot's conversion, that really blasphemy makes no sense except for someone who believes. And so in a very real sense, of course, and that's a bit self-evident, I know, but in a sense, to call a program blasphemous is problematic in a culture like our own now. And certainly, as many of you may have known, there is great furor and debate over the Father Ted series, the Radio 4, or Program 4 series about Irish priests. And what is really interesting about this is that a very great number of practicing Irish Catholics quite like it, and disaffected or lapsed Catholics hate it, because they consider it mockery. Go figure. Yeah?
You're probably not aware that in this area, Halifax, there is a country music radio station that broadcasts country music all the livelong day, except from 7 in the evening till 9, when there's 2 hours of religious broadcasting, which are, I'm not sure of the names of the programs, but they're American preachers. I think one is called In Touch, which comes from Montreal. So 2 hours in prime time of religious broadcasting.
Well, I think for me, that enters into a realm of some semantic confusion, and I am more concerned, frankly, with how the media itself deals with the role of religion in Canada than with the purchasing of time by specific religious organizations that have every right to do so. I'm not disputing that right. But that is religious broadcasting, yes. I wouldn't argue with that. But it's rather different from what I'm talking about and what I'm concerned with. And that is the treatment of the secular media, by the secular media, of religious subjects, which I think is much more important, because religious broadcasting, let me put it this way, religious broadcasting as niche broadcasting is the kiss of death. I find the proliferation of programs with a specifically religious mandate not a help, but a hindrance to the serious discussion of religion as a political and social determinative. Because one of the ways in which you can isolate or privatize religion even further is to move it to the periphery of niche broadcasting. Simply say, well, you've got the health station, and you have the sports station, and you have the nutrition station, and we've got the golf station, we've got the weather station, we've got the religion station. And although I am a great admirer of the quality of work that's done by Vision TV, and I am, I regret the fact that a Vision TV is even needed. because it would seem to me that when religion is part of the national fabric, when religious discourse and religious subjects are as important as the morning sports news, right? When religious issues are given as much primetime coverage, right, as the fashion plates that we often get, we even have a fashion station now, it seems to me then we've arrived. But the increasing isolation of religion by putting it in some kind of narrow cubbyhole so that you can access it, if you like, on a specific network, or it becomes specialized broadcasting, or it becomes broadcasting that has to be underwritten by specific groups, faith groups and interest groups, seems to me to significantly diminish the value of religion as, if you like, quotation marks, public property, which I think it must always remain. Yes?
Dr. Higgins, Professor Tom Langan, who I'm sure you know,
Yes.
Professor Emeritus of the University of Toronto, he told me a few days ago that when he founded the Catholic Civil Rights League, the first phone call he received was from the executive director of B'nai B'rith. And he said to him, in the name of heavens, man, where have you been? Why has it taken you so long to start defending your own rights? Your ass is being kicked from one end of the country to the other. Welcome to the club. They don't take us on as easily as they do you.
They don't take...
I can provide you with a synopsis of that program that my friend is speaking about. We have it here. I'd like you to comment on it. And apparently it's being funded by our beloved CPC with public tax dollars. Something that I resent highly.
Well, I think you have cause to resent it. I'm just unaware of the program. It's just, I don't know anything about it.
Make you aware.
Yeah. I can certainly find out more when I return to Toronto, hunt down the producer and find out how such a thing came to pass. I certainly would do that. But it seems to me that B'nai B'rith is right, the Anti-Defamation League is right. As I'm sure you know, I have on my email on a regular basis the Canadian Islamic Association Congress. The Canadian Islamic Congress regularly feeds me email concerning their deliberate effort to enlighten Canadian reporters and correspondents who continue to identify devout Muslims as terrorists. And their extreme anger at their misrepresentation in the public media, and they're absolutely right. The media has to be vigilant. The establishment of ombudspersons, the Toronto Star has done that now, and rather successfully, where people who have willy-nilly or with impunity attacked religious sensitivities and religious sensibility are called to court, including religious reporters who do it under the rubric of freedom of the press. Certainly, an ombudsperson is essential for the national public airwaves as well. You're quite right. Yes.
This past weekend, Dr. Higgins, I attended a meeting of Catholic catechists in this diocese, and one of the concerns of the group was how to make the general populace of the area more aware of Catholic education. And the group came to the conclusion that the church locally doesn't do very well in the mass media. And I was wondering, the church nationally, in any ways, has been able to make contact with them. How do they feel about making their presence as an educational, making Catholic education present to Canada, in a sense of saying, not so much teaching catechism as saying, we are a resource that's available to enlighten you on matters of faith and ethics and morality. How do you have any idea how the bishops nationally would think about approaching that problem?
Well, I think that's a very important problem, and it's a difficult issue because you can't appear at any time to be buying the interest of the media. And so everything has to be done rather surreptitiously, if you like, rather clandestinely. And it's not a desirable thing to say in public, but it's how it's done. It's you lobby. You find the ear of a sensitive reporter or correspondent or columnist who will say, yes, I will pay attention to this. Let me give you an example. Give you some examples. Jim Coyle is a columnist now for the Toronto Star. Not infrequently, Coyle will raise religious issues in a sensitive and meaningful way. In what is, in effect, a city column. It's a city column. It's not a religion column. Leslie Scrivener who's a remarkable young correspondent and writer, is very sensitive to religious issues and has had to work in a relatively hostile media context in order to build up her credentials, in order, in fact, to have her word trusted. I was talking to a friend of mine, Dr. John McPherson, who's here this evening and knows the media fairly well, of a person we know mutually, Bob Harvey, who's the editor of the Ottawa Citizen in Ottawa. And Bob is very sensitive to religious issues and making sure that the story is told and is told right. I think the media is